I want you to think about the last time you stayed silent when you should have spoken up, or the last time you didn't apply for that role, or didn't end that relationship. Because a voice in your head whispered, "What if it all goes wrong?" We've been sold this lie that the goal of personal growth is to become fearless. We see people on stages or on your feed who look bulletproof, and we think, "I'll start my life once I feel like they do." But I'm telling you, as someone who has spent a decade studying the mechanics of why we do what we do, that day is a mirage. If you're waiting for the fear to go away before you move, you are effectively giving fear a seat at the head of your boardroom for the rest of your life. Think about it this way. Fear isn't a wall you have to smash through. It's actually more like a shadow. When you see a giant shadow on the wall, your instinct is to panic, to freeze, or to run. But a shadow can't actually hurt you. It only exists because there is a light behind you that you're refusing to turn around and look at. Most of us spend our entire lives running away from shadows, never realizing that the monster chasing us has no physical substance. It's a projection of a brain that is still evolved for a world that no longer exists. I know how heavy it feels. I know that feeling in the pit of your stomach when you're about to do something brave, and your mind starts showing you a highlight reel of every time you've ever failed. It's exhausting, isn't it? Being the person who has all this potential locked inside, but the key is guarded by a feeling you can't seem to outrun. We don't lose our lives to the big dramatic tragedies. We lose them in the quiet moments. We lose them in the 30 seconds where we decide to stay in bed rather than face the day. We lose them in the 3 minutes we spend drafting a text message only to delete it because we're afraid of looking too keen or too desperate. These are the micro decisions that build the invisible cage you're living in right now. But here is the truth that most people will never tell you. Fear is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of growth. If you don't feel fear, it means you aren't doing anything new. It means you're repeating the same year over and over again and calling it a life. The goal isn't to be fearless. The goal is to be fear brave. It's to develop a relationship with that discomfort where you can look it in the eye and say, "I see you. I hear what you're worried about, but you don't get to drive the car today. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to show you how to take the wheel back." To understand how to truly master this feeling, we have to look past the modern noise and toward a perspective that has survived for centuries. I remember coming across a concept that completely shifted how I view my own internal chaos. It's based on a piece of wisdom from the 13th century poet Rumi called The Guest House. I want you to imagine your life, your mind, and your emotional state as a physical house every morning. There is a new arrival at your front door. One day it's joy, the next it's gratitude, and then inevitably fear shows up. Most of us treat fear like a home invader. We see it through the window. We panic, we deadbolt the door, and we spend all our energy pushing our weight against that door to keep it out. But here's the problem with that. When you spend your life guarding the door, you become a prisoner of your own home. You can't go into the kitchen, you can't look out the windows, and you certainly can't go outside and live because you're too busy making sure that guest doesn't get in. The Zen perspective teaches us something radical. It says, welcome and entertain them all, even if they are a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Think about it this way. Why are you so afraid of feeling afraid? It's because you've labeled the emotion as bad or dangerous. But in the monk's mind, there is no such thing as a bad emotion. There is only energy. When fear arrives, a monk doesn't say, "I am terrified." They say, "Ah, here is fear. It has come to visit." There is a profound power in that tiny shift of language. When you say, "I am afraid," you are identifying with the emotion. You become the fear. But when you treat it as a guest, you create a space between who you are and what you feel. You are the house. The fear is just the weather passing through it. The house doesn't get destroyed by a storm, it simply weathers it. I know you might be thinking, that sounds nice, Matthew, but my fear feels like it is burning the house down. I hear you. But the reason it feels like it is burning is that you are trying to trap it in a closet. When you try to suppress an emotion, you give it nowhere to go. So it vibrates at a higher and higher frequency until it feels like it is going to shatter you. The ancient wisdom here is simple yet incredibly difficult for our modern, control-obsessed brains to grasp. Resistance is what creates suffering. If you let the guest in, sit them down at the table, and acknowledge they are there, they eventually get bored and leave. Fear only stays as long as you are fighting it, because your fight is what gives it a reason to exist. It's the paradox of the Zen mind. The moment you stop trying to get rid of the fear is the exact moment it loses its power over you. You aren't broken because you feel anxious about that conversation or that career move. You're just a host who has forgotten that you own the house. You've let the guests convince you that they're the landlord. It's time to stop standing at the door with your shoulder pressed against the wood. Take a breath, step back, and let the guest in. You'll realize very quickly that while fear can sit at your table, it doesn't have the right to tell you what is for dinner. Now, I want to take you out of the metaphorical guest house for a moment and look at the hard wiring of your brain, because empathy is important. But understanding the why is what gives you leverage. I remember reading a study on the amygdala, that tiny almond, shaped part of your brain responsible for your survival, and it changed everything for me. It explained why we feel like we're dying when we're actually just facing a social or emotional risk. You see, your brain is a masterpiece of evolution, but it's running on software that is 200,000 years old. Back then, if you were rejected by your tribe, it wasn't just an awkward Friday night, it was a death sentence. You couldn't hunt alone. You couldn't defend yourself against predators alone. So your brain evolved to treat social rejection with the same level of biological urgency as a physical attack. Think about it this way. When you're staring at your phone, terrified to hit send on a vulnerable message, or when you're standing in the wings of a stage with your heart hammering against your ribs, your brain doesn't see a growth opportunity. It sees a saber-toothed tiger. It triggers what we call the amygdala hijack, your prefrontal cortex, the logical, rational part of you that knows everything will be fine, effectively goes offline. Your body floods with cortisol and adrenaline, your pupils dilate, and your breath becomes shallow. You are literally being prepared to fight or flee for your life. The tragedy is that most of us interpret this biological noise as a signal that we should stop, we think. If I feel this much physical dread, it must be a sign that I'm doing something wrong. But in modern life, the opposite is usually true. That physical dread is often just the sound of your comfort zone stretching. There is a concept in modern psychology called safety behaviors. These are the subtle things you do to cope with anxiety, like checking your phone to avoid eye contact over preparing for a meeting until you are exhausted, or ghosting someone before they can reject you. You think these behaviors are protecting you, but the scientist's perspective reveals a darker truth. Safety behaviors are actually what keep your fear alive. Every time you use a safety behavior, you are sending a message to your nervous system. You are saying, the only reason we survived the encounter is because we hid. You are reinforcing the idea that the world is dangerous and that you are incapable of handling it. You're essentially training your brain to be more afraid the next time. I know it's frustrating. You feel like a passenger in a body that is overreacting to things that aren't actually life-threatening. But here is the breakthrough. Your brain cannot tell the difference between a real threat and an imagined one. But it can learn through experience. Think about attachment theory and how it plays into this. If you grew up in an environment where your needs weren't consistently met, your threat detection system is likely set to high. sensitivity. You're scanning for abandonment or failure in every conversation. You're not anxious. You have an overactive alarm system that hasn't been updated to your current reality. To rewire this, we have to use something called inhibitory learning. We have to stay in the uncomfortable situation long enough for the amygdala to realize, oh, wait, we didn't die. If you send the text and they don't reply, and you sit with that discomfort without rushing to fix it or distract yourself, you are literally re-educating your brain. You are teaching your nervous system that your catastrophe is actually survivable. You aren't a coward for feeling this way. You are a biological being with a very loyal, very confused brain that is trying its best to keep you alive. But you have to decide today, are you going to let your 200,000-year-old survival instincts run your 21st century life? Or are you going to use the science of exposure to prove to yourself that you are much stronger than your ancestors ever needed to be? So how do we actually move? How do we take all this ancient wisdom and biological science and turn it into a Tuesday afternoon where you finally do the thing you've been avoiding? We need a bridge. We need a way to go from I understand my fear to I am bigger than my fear. I want to give you 4 specific practical steps that you can use the moment you finish this video. The first step is a technique I call name it to tame it. Most of the time, fear is a cloud. It's a vague, heavy fog that sits over your whole life. When you say, I'm just an anxious person, you've given the fog permission to stay. I want you to start practicing linguistic disidentification. Instead of saying, I am afraid, I want you to say, I am noticing a sensation of fear in my chest. It sounds like a small semantic tweak, but psychologically, it's a massive shift when you say, I am afraid. You are the emotion. There's no room for anything else. But when you say, I am noticing fear, you have created a gap. There is the observer, which is you, and there is the feeling. In that gap lies your power to choose. You're no longer the storm, you're the mountain, and the storm is just something happening to you. Step 2 is performing what I call the cost of the comfort zone audit. We usually spend all our mental energy calculating the risk of taking a leap. What if I ask for the raise and they say no? What if I go on the date and it's awkward? We are experts at imagining the cost of failure, but we are terrible at calculating the cost of inaction. I want you to be brutally honest with yourself right now. What is the certain cost of staying exactly where you are for the next 6 months? What does it cost your self-esteem to know you backed down again? What does it cost your future self to stay in a situation that has no room for your growth? Think about it this way. Failure is a possibility if you try, but regret is a mathematical certainty if you don't. When you realize that staying still is actually more dangerous than moving, the fear of the leap starts to feel a lot more manageable. Step 3 is the 5-second exposure. There is a famous psychological principle that the longer you think about a difficult task, the less likely you are to do it. We call this analysis paralysis. Your brain uses that time to build a case for why you should stay safe. You have to learn to act before the narrative starts. If you need to make a call, do it within 5 seconds of thinking about it. If you need to leave the house, get your shoes on before your brain can tell you why the couch is better. This isn't about being reckless. It's about bravery. You are training your brain to trust your intent more than your hesitation. You're proving to your nervous system that the action is the priority, not the feeling. Finally, step 4 is the most powerful shift of all, the alchemy. I remember reading about the physiological markers of anxiety and excitement. Here is the secret. On a physical level, they are almost identical. In both states, your heart races, your palms might get sweaty, and your breathing gets shallow. The only real difference is the story your mind tells you about those sensations. Next time you feel that surge of fear before a big moment, I want you to say out loud, I am excited. Don't try to be calm. Calm is too far away from where you are. You can't go from 100 miles per HR to 0 in a second. But you can pivot if you tell yourself you're excited. You're not fighting the energy in your body. You're just giving it a different destination. You're turning I'm under attack into I'm getting ready for a challenge. I know this isn't easy. If it were easy, everyone would be living their dream life. But you're not everyone. You're the person who stayed for these 9 minutes because you know deep down that there is a version of you waiting on the other side of this discomfort. You don't need to be fearless to start. You just need to be willing to be uncomfortable for a few minutes at a time. The cage doors are unlocked, and they have been the whole time. You just had to stop being afraid of the sound the hinges make when they open. I want you to take a second and just breathe. Seriously, because we've covered a lot in these 9 minutes. And right now, your brain is probably trying to figure out how to categorize everything I've just told you. It's trying to decide if this is just another video you'll forget by tomorrow morning, or if this is the moment the trajectory of your life actually changes. I remember talking to a friend once who had spent years stuck in a career he hated. He was paralyzed by the what-ifs. What if I quit and can't find anything else? What if I am not as good as I think I am? He told me something I'll never forget. He said, Matthew, I'm not afraid of failing. I'm afraid of the version of me that succeeds because I don't know who that person is yet. That is the deepest truth about fear that no one wants to admit. We aren't just afraid of the dark, we're afraid of our own light. We're afraid of the responsibility that comes with being powerful. Because if you realize today that fear doesn't have to control you, then you no longer have an excuse to stay small. You no longer have a reason to play it safe. And that realization is terrifying in its own way. But think about it this way. You have been carrying a backpack full of stones your entire life, thinking that the weight was just a part of who you are. You thought the heaviness was your personality, or your anxiety, or your trauma. But today, we've looked inside that bag. We've seen the monk perspective that tells you these stones are just passing guests. We've seen the scientist perspective that proves the weight is just an outdated survival mechanism. And we've laid out the steps to start taking those stones out one by one. What happens to the person who drops the bag? They don't just walk faster, they start to see the world differently. When you aren't constantly scanning for threats, you start seeing opportunities. When you aren't terrified of rejection, you start seeing connection. The world hasn't changed in the last 9 minutes, but your capacity to navigate it has. I know you might feel like you've lost too much time. You're looking back at the years fear stole from you, the relationships you didn't pursue, the dreams you let gather dust, and you feel a sense of grief. I want you to hear me when I say this. None of that time was wasted. If it brought you to this realization right now, every moment of hiding was just you preparing for the moment you finally decided to be seen. The 9-minute promise I made you at the start of this video wasn't that fear would vanish. It was that fear would never control you again. Control is about who is holding the map. From this moment forward, fear can be the passenger. It can talk, it can complain, it can tell you that the next turn is dangerous. But it doesn't get to touch the steering wheel. You are the driver. I want you to do one thing for me before you move on with your day. I want you to identify the one micro-bravery action you've been avoiding. Don't pick the biggest thing in your life. Pick the one that is right in front of you. Maybe it is an email. Maybe it is a conversation you need to have with your partner. Maybe it's just looking at your bank account or your calendar with total honesty. Apply the 5-second rule, countdown, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and go. Don't wait for the feeling of confidence to arrive. Confidence is a ghost that only appears after the work is done. Bravery is the only thing required of you right now. Think about the study I mentioned earlier, the one about how our brains rewire through experience. Every time you act in the face of fear, you are literally changing the physical architecture of your brain. You are building a new you, a version of you that is resilient, capable, and profoundly alive. I believe in you, not because of some generic potential, but because you are a biological miracle that has survived every single worst day of your life so far. Your track record for surviving fear is 100%. Don't let your mind tell you otherwise. Life doesn't reward the people who are the most talented or the most fearless, or the ones who have it all figured out. It rewards the people who are willing to be uncomfortable. It rewards the people who are willing to let the guest of fear sit at the table without letting him take over the house. You've given me 9 minutes. Now, go give yourself the rest of your life. Go be brave. Not because you aren't afraid, but because you have finally realized that you are so much more than your fear.